My name is Ace. I work at the King and Queen Branch Library, and today we're going to be learning how to make sourdough bread from start to finish. The first thing you're going to need to do is acquire a sourdough starter. There's a couple ways that you can do that. The fastest way would be to get an already fed starter from either your local bakery or a friend that already bakes sourdough. Most people will be happy to give you some of their sourdough starter, me included. They'll just break you off a piece and you can start baking bread almost the next day. Another way you can do is buy some dried sourdough starter offline, and it just kind of comes in flakes like this, which you'll use to add water and flour, and you'll be able to start making bread within a few days. Another way to acquire it is to make it yourself, and what this boils down to is just water and flour in equal amounts. So King Arthur starter, if you Google that online, it'll give you a really nice step-by-step on how to make your own starter. That's how I started baking bread. And the problem with that is it will take about a week or two of your starter really becoming nice and active and bubbly before you can start making bread. This is one of the most important aspects of sourdough baking, is we really want a nice, active, bubbly starter in order for our bread to be the same way. One way you can kind of tell if you got a nice, active starter is when you feed it, it'll double or even triple in size within about 4 to 6 hours. And if it does that, then we know we got a really nice starter, and we're going to want to use that starter at its peak, which means it'll keep on rising and rising and rising. And then once it eats up all of its food, all of the sugars and carbs in here, then it's going to start falling. And it's good to kind of get to know your starter. You can put a rubber band around it at the bottom when you feed it, and then realize how fast it's rising, and that gives you a kind of rough estimate of when to use your starter. So I really can't stress that enough, that we really want a nice, active, bubbly starter at its peak when we're going to use it in our bread making. So over on this side of the table, we have all of our equipment. We got a glass bowl, and we want a large glass bowl because it's going to start small, but it is going to rise, and sometimes even fill this whole bowl. We want a plastic spoon or spatula for mixing. We want a scale. This is a weighing scale. It weighs in grams and ounces. Mainly only use grams. And the reason we want a weighing scale rather than like measuring cups is with flour, it doesn't always weigh the same, so we can get different amounts of flour each time that we're baking. So a weighing scale really lets us get that nice consistency of a nice loaf that we want every time we're baking. And these are about $20, $30 at Walmart, and you can use them for a lot of things in the kitchen. With a pan with a lid, this is an enamel cast iron pan. Pretty much we want a lid, and then we want the pan to be able to withstand temperatures of about 450 to 500 degrees in the oven. So I use enamel. You can use regular cast iron or a roasting pan. And this is just a lid as well. And in our pans, we're going to line them with parchment paper. And it is important to use parchment paper and not wax paper, because wax paper will melt in the oven, and parchment paper will brown a little bit depending on the higher temperatures you get, but it's perfect for what we need. Another thing we're going to use is a lame. This is a bread lame, and it's pretty much just a razor blade on the end of a stick. And this is what we use to score our bread, and that kind of lets us control where it's going to pop and rise. Whereas if we didn't score it on the top, most of the time it's going to bust on the bottom, and it's still edible, but you're not going to get that nice, lovely loaf that you really want. Another thing we're going to use is a banneton. This is what we do our final proof in. So we're going to put our dough in here, and then it's going to be covered with this and go into the fridge. if you don't have a banneton, these are easily acquired off of Amazon, is I think where I got this from. You can use just a glass bowl with a lint-free cloth, and then it just goes in here like this, and we're going to flour it and put the dough in and then cover it, and then that will go in the fridge. It's important that we use kind of rice flour when we're flouring our banneton or a lint-free cloth. The rice flour, it just has a lower porosity than white flour does, so it helps the dough not stick when we're turning it over into our pan to bake. Got all our equipment covered. So the next thing we're going to move on to is I'm going to go over the sourdough starter again. We want a nice active starter, and we're going to use it at its peak in order when we're going to use to bake. And then we're going to use some water. This is just regular tap water. We're going to use some kosher salt, although any type of salt will work. And most importantly, some good flour. And I really like King Arthur flour because it's nice and consistent as well. This is bread flour. It's just a little higher protein content, which helps our gluten develop a little better. But I also use all-purpose flour, and that works just as well. The main thing we want to consider is that it's unbleached. Our active yeast, so this is like a live organism, doesn't do well with bleached flour. It likes all those sugars and natural things in the flour that it uses to eat and grow with. So I think that mainly covers all of the stuff we're going to be using today. So let's dive right into baking some bread. So here I am about to feed my sourdough starter. And the sourdough starter is pretty much equal parts water, equal parts starter, and equal parts flour. So I have 50 grams of starter in here right now. So all I'm going to do is feed it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. And that'll give me a nice healthy starter to work with when I go to make bread. So we're just pouring in 50 grams of water. $50 grams of flour. Make sure to zero your scale. There we go. And then we'll just mix that up. And this is called feeding your starter. So we're giving it some more food so it can survive. This is a living organism, so you want to treat this like your child. Keep it alive, feed it every day. Try not to neglect it too much, although it does happen. So the warmer the temperature in your house or wherever you're making bread, the faster that this is going to rise. So you can see right now, it's right here. So a good thing to do to kind of get to know your starter is to put a rubber band around the bottom of it where it's starting, like that. And then, so as time goes on, in about 4 hours, hopefully, if we have a really nice active starter, it's gonna at least double in size, hopefully about there, and then might even go a little bit further. So I'll put a rubber band on when it gets to the top, or about every couple hours if I'm really trying to get to know my starter, I'll come and check it in an hour and put a rubber band to see how fast it's growing. But this is the most important part of sourdough baking, is you really want a nice, active, bubbly, fermented starter when you're going to bake your bread. Okay, so here we are about to mix our dough, and I got everything on the table that I need to put in my bowl. I got my starter, flour, salt, and water, and that's gonna produce a nice, lovely bowl of sourdough bread. So first, we're going to make sure our starter is nice and active. And here you can see, this is where the starter started when I mixed the flour, water, and starter. And as you can see, it rose up to there, and now it's starting to fall back, which means right as it's falling back is right when we want to use it. So it's at perfect. You can see it's nice and bubbly in there. And if you mix it around, you can kind of hear it. You can see all those lovely bubbles. They've been eating all the sugars, and they're ready to do the work for us now. So we're gonna add 50 grams of starter. We're gonna turn on our scale with the bowl on. So that means our scale is zeroed with the bowl. So we're gonna add 50 grams of starter. Okay. Inside. And then we're going to add 350 grams of water. Make sure you zero your scale first after we put our starter in, so we're starting from scratch. 350 grams. And then we're going to just mix it up a little bit, just to get our starter kind of worked throughout the water, broken up a little bit so it mixes evenly. And then we're going to add 500 grams of flour. Make sure that you zero out your scale again, so we're at 0. 500 grams of flour. Okay, got that in there. And the next thing, last thing, zero out your scale one more time. And we're gonna add salt. And that's 10 grams of salt. And we're just gonna mix it in, pour it over. There we go. And then we can turn off our scale, and we're just gonna mix this up until all of our dried flour becomes wet. So don't worry too much about if you go over a little bit on the starter or the flour. Just make sure it's just around those numbers. And then as you get more familiar with baking dough, you can change up the numbers, so you can add more water for a wetter dough, and or add less water for a more firmer dough. It kind of just depends on taste. The 350 grams of water with the 500 grams of flour is kind of a good starting recipe to where it gives us a nice firm dough, easy to work with, but and still provides the flavor and the structure that we want in our dough. So you don't have to mix this too much. Our goal is just to get all of this dried flour on the side and just kind of mix that in with the dough, so we don't got any dried flour left. There we go. Let's get that off of there. So now we got our dough, and it's just a big old clump. Not too much going on in there yet, but we're gonna get our clean plastic bag and then just put that over it so it doesn't dry out our dough, and leave that on the counter for about an hour before we'll do our first pulls and folds. Okay, so here we are an hour later of just sitting on the counter. We've done our first mix already, and now we're gonna do our first set of pulls and folds. So this is the kind of equivalent of kneading the dough, but we're just gonna keep it in the bowl so it's less messy, and we're gonna take 2-3 fingers, mainly use 2 and our thumb, and just kind of come around the bowl and bring it into a ball. So we're gonna take it and we're just gonna kind of pull it, and you can see it's already building its gluten here. And we're just gonna put it on the other side, and we're just gonna rotate that. So we're gonna take it, pull it a little bit, and bring it onto the other side. And these are what we call pulls and folds. So we're making it into a bowl, and we're gonna do this about 3 to 4 times over the course of a few hours. So it's not exactly important on the timing of it. I just kind of let it make it work with my schedule. So I'll mix it, I'll go away, do something, and when I think about it, I'll come back, and whether it be 30 minutes or an hour and 30 minutes, and just come and do my sets of pulls and folds. So like I said, don't get too caught up on the timing of it. Just kind of make it work with your schedule, and it'll just come with experience of feeling the dough and kind of seeing it and knowing how far along it's come. So you can already see from our big mush, the dough is already getting a little silkier. This is just our first set of pulls and folds, so that's a really good sign. And we're gonna do about 10 to 20 pulls and folds over it, just bring it into a nice ball. And this will be the most pulls and folds that we do because it's our first set. But as we go along, we don't want to really mess up all of the air bubbles that it's creating and building and working for. So we don't want to disturb it as much, but this time we do quite a bit. There we go. So that's our first set of pulls and folds, and we got our nice ball of dough. So we're gonna leave it on the counter for about another hour, and it's gonna kind of slowly fall, and then we're gonna come back and do another set of pulls and folds. So just leave it on the counter for about another hour, covered. All right, so here we are after another hour on the counter. We're gonna uncover it, and you can kind of see the dough is forming a little bit more silky texture, which means we're on the right track. So we've mixed it and then let it sit on the counter for an hour. We've done our first pulls and folds, and now we let it sit on the counter for another hour, and we're gonna do our second set of pulls and folds. So we're just gonna take our fingers and just grab it just like we did the first time. Just bringing it and going across the dough, bringing it into our ball again, and you'll kind of feel the dough kind of change texture over time. Okay, so as you can see, you can pick it up, and we got our ball here, and we're just gonna cover it and leave it on the counter for another hour. Okay, so here we are about 3-ish hours after first mixing our dough with all of our ingredients. So we're gonna uncover it, and then you can see our starter has doubled in size, and at this point, it's got a nice kind of crest at the top of it. So you can tell that it's still rising a little bit. It hasn't started falling back, so it's still consuming its food and rising, and it might rise just a little bit. I usually use my starter about 4 hours after I feed it, and it's been about 3 right now, so I'd probably wait 1 more hour before I would use it to make a loaf of bread. So we're just gonna do, just like we did before, or another set of pulls and folds. So we're just using these 3 fingers and just grabbing it and then just pulling it across the dough. And we're gonna do that until we form another ball. And so each time we do our pulls and folds, we want to be a little bit more gentler as we go along, because our starter has been eating the dough. It's making the bubbles and getting airy, and we want to protect all of the hard work that our starter has been doing. go. So you got a nice dough, and you can see that the dough is nice, it's getting silkier every time that we do our pulls and folds and the starter is working its magic. The dough just becomes a nice silky texture and looks a little better every time. So that's our third set of pulls and folds. We're gonna do one more set, so I'm gonna leave it out on the counter for another hour and then come back and then do our last set of pulls and folds before we do our overnight proof. Okay, so here we are with our last set of pulls and folds. So this is our last set of pulls and folds before we leave it out on the counter overnight. And so we want to be a little bit more gentle with this one. Like I said before, we're just going to do the same thing that we did with our first few sets of pulls and folds. Just bring it into a ball, and you can really tell the dough is starting to become more silkier. It's becoming a really nice texture. And you can see, I don't know, you can see all those bubbles on the bottom. That's a really good sign. Okay, so we have done all of our pulls and folds, and now we're gonna leave it out on the counter for about 8 hours, and hopefully when we come back, we'll have a nice big bowl of dough and bubbles. So the next morning when you uncover your dough, you should have a nice big bowl of bubbles and dough. You can see that big old bubble right there. That's exactly what we want to see. That means our starter has been working for us all overnight. We got some really nice bubbles on the bottom of our dough, and we got a nice big bowl of dough. So the next thing that we're going to do is get our banneton ready, and this is already seasoned. So when you first get a banneton, you want to kind of spray it with a little bit of water and then put your rice flour on it, and that'll give you a nice seasoning to start with. And then each time you still want to season it, and I just use a flour shaker. So we're just going to go around, season our banneton. Flour, and this is so the dough doesn't stick to it, so you want to give it a pretty heavy flour with the rice flour. And you can also do the same thing if you don't have a banneton. You can use your lint-free cloth, and this is just the cloth set in there, and then you can just flour it just like you would the banneton. And we're going to finally pull it together into one more ball and then place it into our banneton. So we'll just do our pulls and folds, but you want to be really delicate this time because we don't want to disrupt all of these bubbles that we had working for us overnight. So just pull it into a loose ball, and then you can just pick it up. And you can really see it's got a really nice smell to it, nice fermenty smell, and then just place it into your banneton. And we got our ball, and then we're gonna flour that. Just want to flour the sides of it, just so as it proves, it doesn't stick to the banneton. And then we're gonna cover that. And this is gonna go in the fridge for at least 2 hours, or maximum of about 8 hours, depending on how fermented your dough is. Okay, so I just took my banneton out of the refrigerator after it's been in there for about 4 hours now. So we can uncover that, and you can kind of see that the dough is a little firmer. And that'll be easier when we go and score it in our bread pan. So we want a piece of parchment paper. This helps it from sticking inside here. Put that there. And now what I'm going to do is just flip over my pan onto my banneton. And then just grab my banneton like that and then just flip it over. And then you should be able to raise it. And out comes our dough. And if you push on the outside of the dough, you'll spring back, and that's a good sign that our dough is ready to be baked. So we'll get our bread lame, and you can use a razor or a really sharp knife, and we're pretty much just doing about a 1/4 inch cut across the whole thing of the dough. And we're just gonna, because we're still getting used to baking sourdough, we're just gonna do a nice line instead of doing some fancy scoring job. And this helps the dough to, when it rises, it's gonna come out this way. Whereas if we didn't do the score, a lot of times it'll kind of do its own thing and come bursting out the bottom a lot of times. So as you can see, we got a nice deep score. You usually want to do it deeper than probably you think. And we'll cover it. And this is going to go straight into the oven. You can either do it preheated or unheated. I do it without it being heated at first, so it goes into a cold oven, and then I just set it on 500 for about an hour is what my oven takes. But each oven is different, and it might take a few bakes to really get to know how long your bread should be in there. Okay, so we just took our pan out from the oven. It's been in there for 60 minutes on 500 degrees, and let's see how it turns out. We got a nice, lovely, crusty loaf of sourdough. And you can see where we scored it. Got all those lovely gluten strands in there. And if you wanted it not as dark, you can bake it for less. But I love a nice crusty, even a little charred on the top is perfect. So that'll just go onto our cooling pan. And then now the hardest part is you don't want to cut into it for at least an hour. If you cut into it too early, it will kind of get doughy inside. It releases the steam, so we just want to let it cool and let the steam kind of go out of the bubbles and let them rest themselves. Okay, now my favorite part, cutting into the loaf. We got our bread knife here, and you really want a sharp bread knife. The crust on a sourdough is pretty tough. So this has been resting for a few hours now, and now we're ready to cut into it. Let's see what we got. And that's what all of our bubbles have been doing. That's why we want a really nice, strong starter when we start, so we get these really nice cavities of bubbles, and that's what we love so much about bread. I hope you all have enjoyed this sourdough program, and hope you can replicate this yourselves. Thanks for joining along.